In my previous entry, I talked about some of the precursor works, as I call them, the short stories written by Mathew and Abby that they drew on when they wrote the original of A Christmas Carol and started on it in 1838. So I mentioned also that there was one in particular called The New Year's Bells, which apparently was written by Mathew, which is very much on target. So I thought I'd just turn this into story hour here, and I'll just go ahead and read it. I won't make any commentary on it. I'll just read it straight through, and if you're familiar with A Christmas Carol, you can compare yourself. First of all, you may have noticed in the background there's a new addition to my wall here, and what I've done is to frame the etching of myself as Mathew Franklin Whittier in my past life. The very first one that I ever saw and recognized. So what I'm going to do here is just make a little video of it and cut that in, if I can get it to focus, that is. There it is. That's Mathew. And I would say that the apple hasn't fallen very far from the tree. I still look pretty darn similar. I have the same higher mind and so on, as I've explained. Now, let's start story hour. So here we have The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales by Francis A. Durivage, or ostensibly by Francis A. Durivage. Just about everything in here, with the possible exception of the title piece, The Three Brides, which is kind of mean in a way, so I don't think Mathew wrote that, but everything else was written by Mathew Franklin Whittier and stolen, swindled from Mathew by Durivage, who, as I've said many times, near as I can tell, he must have tricked Mathew into signing a bogus contract that gave him rights to everything in Mathew's unpublished portfolio, which is to say a whole bunch of humorous stories, or not, this one really isn't so much humorous, it's an inspiring story, and a whole bunch of adventure tales, usually set in other countries. It was like two distinct types of stories. So I also have lots of evidence that this story, The New Year's Bells, probably went back to about 1830 or 1831 or 1832, when I believe Mathew looked like this. Now, I don't know if I can get a good shot of this. This is a portrait which I feel was Mathew about the time that this story was written. Hard to get a good focus. There we are. Maybe you can see it. I can't prove it. It came from South America. There is a plausible way it could have gotten from South America or gotten to South America. I just feel it. I look at that portrait and I say, that's me, that's me, that's me. Every single time I look at it, it's very deep. And yet it seems so unlikely, you know? So I'll just kind of put it out there. There's certain things I can prove. Like I can prove that this is definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier's work that I'm going to be reading. There's things I can come that close to proving, which is to say that this was written well before A Christmas Carol was published. And there's things that I can't prove that I just feel, and I make a distinction between them, and I would ask skeptics to do the same. So now I'm going to get me a sip of water, and I am going to proceed. Again, I'm just going to try to read straight through and refrain from making any commentary, because there's a million comments I could make on this. How the wind blew on the evening of the 31st December in the year, but no matter for the date. It came roaring from the north, fraught with the icy chillness of those Hyperborean regions that are lost to the sunlight for 6 months. The realm of ice-ribbed caverns and snow mountains heaped up above the horizon in the cold and cheerless sky. On it came, that northern blast, howling and tearing and menacing with destruction every obstacle that crossed its path. It dashed right through a gorge in the mountains and twisted the arms of the rock-rooted hemlock and the giant oak as if they were the twigs of saplings. Just checking, looking at my computer to check to see that I'm in the frame. I hate to read the whole story and not be in the frame. Then it swept over the wild, waste meadows, rattling the frozen sedge and whirling into eddies the few dry leaves that remained upon the surface of the earth. Next, it invaded the principal street of the quaint old village and played the mischief with the tall elms and the venerable buttonwoods that stood on either side like sentinels guarding the highway. How the old gilt lion that swung from the signpost of the tavern, hanging like a malefactor in irons, was shaken and disturbed. Backwards and forwards the animal was tossed like a bark upon the ocean. Now he seemed as if about to turn a somerset and circumnavigate the beam from which he hung, creaking and groaning dismally all the while, like an unhappy soul in purgatory. The loose shutters of the upper story of the tavern chattered like the teeth of a witch-ridden old crone. But cheerful fires of hickory and maple were burning within the doors. A merry group was gathered in the old oak parlor, and little recked the guests of the elemental war without. In fact, they knew nothing of it till the driver of the village stagecoach, making his appearance with a few flakes of snow on his snuff-colored surtout, announced, as he expanded his broad hands to the genial blaze, that it was a, quote, wild night out of doors. But on sped the wild wind, driving the snowflakes before it as a victorious army sweeps away the routed skirmishers and outposts of the enemy. Away went the night wind on its wild errand, reaching at last a solitary cottage on the outskirts of the village. Here it reveled in unwonted fury, ripping up the loose shingles from the moss-grown roof tree and forcing an entrance through many a yawning crevice. The scene within the cottage presented a strange and painful contrast to the interior of most of the comfortable houses in the flourishing village through which we have been hurrying on the wings of the cold north wind. The room was scantily furnished. There were 2 or 3 very old-fashioned, rickety, straw-bottomed chairs, an oaken stool or 2, and a pine table. The hour hand of a wooden clock on the mantelpiece pointed to 11. A fire of chips and brushwood was smoldering on the hearth. In one corner of the room, near the fireplace, on a heap of straw, covered with a blanket, 2 little boys lay sleeping in each other's arms. Crouched near the table, her features dimly lighted by a tallow candle, sat a woman advanced in life, clad in faded but cleanly garments, whose hollow cheeks and sunken eye told a painful tale of sorrow and destitution. Those sad eyes were fixed anxiously and imploringly upon the stern, grim face of a hard-featured old man who, with hat pulled over his shaggy gray eyebrows, was standing, resting on a stout staff in the center of the floor. "So, you haven't got any money for me," said the old man in the harshest of all possible voices. "Alas, no, Mr. Worm. If I had, I should have brought it to you long ago," answered the poor woman. "I had raked and scraped a little together, but the sickness of these poor children, poor William's orphans, swept it all away. I haven't got a cent." "So much the worse for you, Mrs. Redmond," answered the old man harshly. "I've been easy with you. I've waited and waited, trusting your promises. I can't wait any longer. I want the money." "You want the money? Is it possible? Report speaks you rich." "It's false, false," said the old man bitterly. "I'm poor. I'm pinched. Ask the townspeople how I live. Do I look like a rich man? No, no. I tell you, I want my dues, and I will have 'em." "I can't pay you," said the woman sadly. "Then you must abide the consequences." "What consequences?" "I've got an execution, that's all," said the hard-hearted landlord. "An execution? What's that?" "A warrant to take all your goods." "My goods," said the poor woman, looking round her with a melancholy smile. "Why, I have nothing but what few things you see in this room. You surely wouldn't take those." "I'll take all I can get." "And leave me here with the bare walls?" "No, no, you walk out of this tomorrow." "In the depth of winter? You cannot be so hard-hearted." "We shall see that." "I care not for myself, but what is to become of these poor children?" "Send them to work in the factory." "But they are just recovering from sickness. They are too young to work. Oh, where can we go? To the poorhouse, said the landlord, fiercely. The poor woman rose, and approaching the landlord's feet, fell upon her knees, clasped her hands, and looked upward in his stern and unrelenting face. Israel Worm, she said, has your heart grown as hard as the nether millstone? Have you forgotten the days of old Lang Syne? Oh, remember that we were once prosperous and happy. Remember that misfortune and not sin has reduced me and mine to the deplorable state in which you find us. Remember that my husband was your early friend, your schoolfellow, your playmate. Remember that when he was rich and you poor, he gave you from his plenty, freely, bountifully, not gave with the expectation of a return. His gifts were boundless, not loans. Therefore I owe him nothing, said the obdurate miser, turning away. You shall hear me out, said the woman, starting to her feet. I ask for a further delay. I ask you to stay the hard hand of the law. You profess to be a Christian. I demand justice and mercy in the name of those sleeping innocents, my poor grandchildren, whose Father is in heaven. You shall be merciful. Heyday, exclaimed the miser, this is fine talk, upon my word. You demand justice, do you? Well, you shall have it. The law is on my side, and I will carry it out to the letter. Then, said the outraged woman, stretching forth her trembling hand, the curse of the widow and the orphan shall be upon you. Sleeping or waking, it shall haunt you. And on your miserable deathbed, when the ugly shapes that throng about the pillow of the dying sinner shall close around you, our malediction shall weigh like lead upon you, and your palsied lips shall fail to articulate the impotent prayer for that mercy to yourself which you denied to others. And now be gone. This house is mine tonight, at least. Afflict it no longer with your presence. Go forth into the night. It is not darker than your benighted soul, nor is the north wind one half so pitiless as you. With a bitter curse upon his lips, but trembling and dismayed in spite of himself, Israel Worm left the presence of the indignant victim of his cruelty and turned his footsteps in the direction of his home. His home! It scarcely deserved the name. There was no fire there to thaw his chilled and trembling frame, no light to gleam athwart the darkness and send forth its pilgrim rays to meet him and guide his footsteps to his threshold. No wife, no children waited eagerly his return. It was the miser's home, dark, desolate, stern, and repulsive. Its deep collars, its thick walls held hidden stores of gold and notes and bonds, but there were garnered up no treasures of the heart. The miser's path lay through the churchyard, a desolate place enough, even in the gay noon of a midsummer day, now doubly repulsive in the wild midnight of midwinter. The wall was ruinous. The black iron gateway frowned, naked and ominous. The field of death was crowded with headstones of slate, and innumerable mounds marked the resting place of many generations. The snow was now gathering fast over the dreary and desolate abode, as the miser stumbled along the beaten pathway, bending against the blast and drift. A strange numbness and drowsiness crept over him. He no longer felt the cold. An uncontrollable desire of slumber possessed him. He sat down upon a flat tombstone and soon lost all consciousness of his actual situation. Suddenly he saw before him the well-known figure of the old sexton of the village, busily occupied in digging a grave. The winter had passed away. It was now midsummer. The birds were singing in the trees, and from the far green meadows sounded the low of cattle and the tinkling of sheep bells. Even the graveyard looked no longer desolate, for on many of the little hillocks bright flowers were springing into bloom and verdure, attesting the affection that outlived death, and decorating with living bloom the precincts of decay. Excuse me for a minute. My friend, for whom are you digging that grave? Asked Israel. The sexton looked up from his work, but did not seem to recognize the spokesman. For a man that died last night, he is to be buried today. Methinks this haste is somewhat indecorous, said Israel Worm. Oh, for the matter of that, said the sexton, the sooner this fellow's out of the way, the better. There's nobody to mourn for him. Is he a pauper then? Oh, no, he was immensely rich. And he had no relations, no friends? For relations, he had a nephew who inherits all his property. The young dog will make the money fly, I tell you. As for friends, he had none. The poor dreaded him. The good despised him, for he was a hard-hearted, selfish, gripping man. In a word, he was a miser, said the sexton. A miser, faltered the trembling dreamer. What was his name? Israel Worm, replied the sexton. Graveyard and sexton faded away. In their place arose a splendid grove of trees, a clearing, a village schoolhouse. Two boys were sauntering along the roadside, engaged in serious, childish talk. One was fair, with golden locks, the other dark-haired and grave of aspect. Israel started, for in the latter he recognized himself, a boy of 50 years ago. Israel, said the golden-haired boy, it's election day tomorrow. We'll hire Browning's horse and chaise and go to Boston and have a grand time on the common seeing all the shows. You forget, Mark, said the dark-haired boy sadly, that I have no money. What of that, replied the other. I have a pocket full, and what's mine is yours, you know. Come, cheer up. You'll one day be as rich as I am, and then it will be your turn to treat, you know. I can afford to be generous, and so would you be if you had the means. Then the shadow passed from the face of the dark-haired boy, and a smile lighted up his countenance, and the two schoolfellows passed on their way together. Grove and schoolhouse passed away, melting into another scene like one of the dissolving views. Israel stood before a huge illuminated screen in the midst of a gaping company of sightseers. He could see nothing but a confused mass of heads, vaguely lighted by the rays from that vast screen. It was some kind of an exhibition. Now, ladies and gentlemen, said a strange voice issuing from the darkness, we shall show you the wonders of the oxyhydrogen microscope, natural objects magnified 5,000 times. Look and behold the proboscis of the common housefly. Israel gazed with the rest, and soon a huge object, resembling the trunk of a monster elephant, appeared on the illuminated disk. It passed away. Now, ladies and gentlemen, said the voice, look well to the illuminated screen. What do you see now? Nothing, was the universal and indignant answer. I thought so, replied the voice. Yet you have before you a miser's soul magnified 5,000 times. 1,000,000 such would not produce an image on the screen. The illuminated disk grew dark and disappeared. Then a lurid light seemed to fill all space, and soon huge billows of flame rolled upward and writhed and twisted together like a myriad of gigantic serpents. Shrieks and howls of anguish issued from the fiery mass, but above all was heard the startling clangor of a bell. Hello, who's this? Cried a voice that evidently issued from a set of powerful human lungs. The miser felt himself roughly shaken by the shoulder and awoke. What's the noise? Fire, he asked, for the bell he had heard in his dream now jarred upon his waking senses. Fire? No, said the man who had awakened him, the butcher of the village. It's the boys ringing in the new year. By the way, I wish you a happy new year, Mr. Worm. A happy new year, Mr. Worm, said the schoolmaster, for he too was present. A happy new year, said Farmer Harrowby. And a happy new year, chorused a dozen other voices. It was great fun wishing a miser a happy new year. Thank you, neighbors. I wish you 1,000, replied Israel cheerfully. How came you asleep there? Asked Farmer Harrowby. Why, you might have perished in the drift. I was overcome by drowsiness, answered Israel. I was very cold. I'd been to make a call on Widow Redmond, and the poor soul was out of wood. By the way, farmer, the first thing after sunrise, I want you to be sure to gear up your ox team and take a cord of your best hickory and pitch pine to the widow. And who'll pay me? Asked the farmer doubtfully. I will, to be sure, answered Israel. Have not I got money enough? Here, hold your hand. And he put a handful of silver in the farmer's honest palm. And you, Mr. Wilkins, he added, addressing the butcher, take her the best turkey you've got, and half a pig, with my compliments, and a happy new year to her. And how about that execution? Asked the constable, who was round with the rest. seeing the old year out and the new year in. Confound the execution. Don't let me hear another word about it, said Israel magnanimously. And now, neighbors, he added, I owe you something for your good wishes. Come along with me to the Golden Lion, and I'll give you the best supper the tavern affords. Hurrah! New Year don't come but once in a 12th month. We will be bound that a merrier party never left the churchyard, even after a funeral, nor a merrier set ever sat down to a festal board, than that which gathered to greet the hospitality of Israel Worm. In the course of the evening, an old Scotch gardener gave it as his opinion that the miser was fey. When a man suddenly changes his character, as when a spendthrift becomes saving, or a niggard generous, the Scotch say that he is fey, and consider the change a forerunner of sudden death. No, my friend, said Israel, overhearing the remark, I am not fey, and I mean to live a long while, heaven willing, for I have just learned that the true secret of enjoying life is to do good to others. I had a dream tonight which has, I trust, made me a wiser and better man. The miser lies buried in yonder churchyard. Israel Worm, a new man, has risen in his place. And as far as my means go, I intend that this shall be a happy new year to every one of my acquaintances. Israel was as good as his word, and never relapsed into his old habits. The widow and the orphan children were provided for by his bounty. He gave liberally to every object of charity. Hospitals, schools, and colleges were the recipients of his bounty. And when he died, in the fullness of years, the blessings of old and young followed him to his last resting place in the old churchyard, where he had dreamed the mysterious dream and been awakened to a better life by the pealing of the New Year's bells. That was definitely Mathew. It definitely was not written by Francis Durivage. Francis Durivage barely wrote anything of his own, and when he wrote anything of his own, it had no heart because he was a sociopath. There's one little possible contraindication that I noticed while I was reading, and that was the dissolving slideshow. Now, did they have dissolving slideshows in 1830, 31? When was that? I mean, I know they had camera obscuras and so on, so they had lenses, they had the ability to use lenses, but did they have an ability to project, sort of, and dissolve between one image and another? Now, it's possible that Mathew updated it. It's possible that this was one of the stories that he actually intended to sell to Francis Durivage to be published. And so he updated it a little bit. It's possible that Francis Durivage updated it himself, because he did update the piece that follows. The one that follows immediately after the very last piece in this book is called The Old Year and the New. And you can see that. It's typical of something Mathew would have written in 1830. I shared one recently, signed with Matthew Starr, that was written in 1832. So this one, at the very end, Durivage has altered the year. So the last paragraph of this one is, the old man was gone. The joyous bells had rung his requiem. The new heir was enthroned, meaning years, old year and new year. And with mingled hope and foreboding commenced the reign of 1853. That's how you know this was published in 1853, because I don't think it has a publication date. But Durivage would have just changed the year, because it would have been 1832 or 1833 or something of that nature. So Mathew could have updated it. I'll do a little bit of research and maybe put something on the screen here with regard to when they had dissolving slideshows. But either way, that's Mathew's work. I don't know if I need to point out the parallels. They're so strong. If you have stuck out that story, the whole story, and I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed reading it. It's a good story. It's obvious that that's either an imitation of A Christmas Carol, or it's clearly a precursor, a very tight precursor work to A Christmas Carol. Now, there's a lady named Professor Natalie McKnight who has a theory that in Boston, Dickens was gifted a copy of a volume of The Offering, which was the volume, the newspaper or magazine that was put out by the girls who worked in the mills in Lowell. There was a progressive mill in Lowell, and Dickens was given a tour. And I don't know if it's a matter of of historical record or if she's just assuming that he was given a copy, because she looks through that and she finds certain stories that she thinks are kind of similar to A Christmas Carol. And she extrapolates that Dickens could have been inspired by what was written by the women in the Lowell Offering when he wrote A Christmas Carol. And it's kind of a feminist perspective and so on. But I guarantee that whatever she's citing as a possible influence is nowhere near as close as this is. And there's other ones. That's not the only one. There's others. There's stories by Abby that are clearly show her influence in A Christmas Carol and so on. But this one is like almost like a template. It's almost like they took a short template of this and said, let's start from this one. And the reason they would have done that instead of writing from scratch is because I believe they were in terrible grief, having just recently lost their 11-month-old son, Joseph. And Matthew was trying to pull Abby out of her terrible depression because he was afraid she was just going to waste away or not eat or something. And the only way that he could pull her out of it was to kind of fire her up with this idea of writing a master story that would uplift mankind. So instead of starting from scratch, they had no inspiration, because they were just emotionally just dead, torn up. But they started with this story, I believe, threw in influences from a few other stories they'd written, and they decided to write a redemption story, a personal, spiritual redemption story, starting with that as a template. It's, when you try to give people proof, they always raise the bar. Not enough, not enough, not enough. But normally this should be enough. It should at least be enough to get people interested, to where they're writing me and they're calling me and they're asking me to speak to their classes on Zoom and they're asking me to speak at conventions. This should be enough for that. And I got a whole bunch more evidence. It's in my paper, summarized in my paper at least. This should be enough just to get people interested. And the same goes with Margaret Fuller and the Star. Never mind the clues that Margaret Fuller wasn't writing the star-signed reviews and essays in the 1844-1846 New York Tribune. And there's quite a few of them. Never mind the evidence that shows that she was lazy and temperamental and didn't like to write unless she really was interested in the subject. And her output was a tenth of Horace Greeley, the editor. And yet there's like 238 of these reviews and essays over that period of time, like 3 or 4 per week. She couldn't possibly have written them just on that basis. But just the fact that Matthew used that pseudonym first, a long time previously, and all through his life, after her death in 1850, he continued to use it and sounded exactly the same as he had in 1844 and 1846. See? That should be enough to get people to say, I want to talk to this guy. I want to know more. I want him to talk to my class. I want him to speak at my convention. I want to publish his article, his paper. Should be enough. So clearly, no matter how much evidence you present, if people are being stubborn, they're going to marginalize you and try to ignore you for as long as they possibly can, if they can't steal it. And they can't steal it because I'm all over the internet and I published this stuff years ago, so it's impossible to steal my work per se and push me out of the picture. So therefore they ignore it. Well, that's human nature, but I mean, word to the wise, here it is. You can find this online. I checked archive.org. Just go to archive.org and type in The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales, and it'll come up for you. I think it's on the Hathi Trust as well. You can download it. You can read it online there. It's not that long. You can compare it to A Christmas Carol. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed that. The reason I did this morning is because I splurged and bought myself a bag of corn chips, and I'm not going to eat those corn chips until I'm editing. So I figured I really had to do this so I could start editing, so I could start eating those corn chips. So I'm on to my editing and my corn chips. And there was something else that I thought about doing this morning. The introduction to A Christmas Carol is Matthew's style. he wrote that introduction. And there's a lot of indicators. What I thought I'd do is to go back to a period, this same period, 1830, 1831, 1832, before Charles Dickens was ever publishing anything, several years before he was publishing anything at all. And remember that this is the New York Constellation. New York newspapers were available in London, at least by subscription, if not in the libraries and reading rooms. The British Library has a full copy of this newspaper, which means it was donated at some point. So somebody had it, which means that Charles Dickens could have been reading Mathew's work in the New York Constellation before he ever started writing and publishing. We don't know that. I'd love to find a reference that says he did, but it's possible. And remember that skeptics are all about what's possible, because if you have somebody going through a hypnotic regression, and it's possible that they could have read a novel before they had the regression session, then they wipe out the whole thing. They give that huge amount of weight, even though it's extremely unlikely that he read it. The fact that he could possibly have read it is a big deal to skeptics. So to those same skeptics, I say Charles Dickens could have read Mathew Franklin Whittier's work in the 1830, 31, 32 New York Constellation. But beyond that, he had a particular style of introducing, even his humorous pieces, he would introduce with a little philosophical preamble. And it was humorous. It had puns in it very often. He would italicize the puns. And, there would be some humorous references. He had a sort of a touch that you can start to recognize if you read enough of them. And I've got hundreds and hundreds. Well, there's like over 300 pieces that he wrote for the Constellation. He was editing it, so he was writing a lot of the material for that paper, even though the editor-in-chief was Asa Green. Asa Green, I think, was running his bookstore there, and Mathew was running the paper. So I started looking at every one of those, at 370 or something like that. I started looking at every one of them and pulling aside into a separate folder the ones that I thought rang kind of like the introduction to A Christmas Carol. And I had so many, I just finally stopped. I had like 100 or something already. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just pull out at random, out of 100, I'll pull out 5 at random and read the introduction. I'll read the introduction to Christmas Carol, and then I'll read these other introductions. Now, Dickens, of course, could also have a similar style, but remember that Mathew was first by several years. So, if you got to compare the two of them, Mathew wins because he was first. They're about the same age, I think. But Mathew started writing as a boy of 12, started publishing in a major newspaper in Boston as a boy of 12. So Mathew has the more august track record and the earlier track record. And he was first. If you're going to talk about style, he was first, and Dickens could have copied him. So I was going to do that. And then I thought, skeptics are so tough that if something isn't flat out in your face proof, like this is in your face, in my opinion. This is so close that this is slap in your face proof. But showing Mathew's voice, that takes intuition. That takes somebody, and see, your intuition is shut off if you're too skeptical. If you're cynical, that shuts off your intuition because your heart is closed. So that's for a group of people who are friendly and interested and open-minded and think that I could be correct. Then they'll see it because they'll be able to feel the voice that's speaking to them in the constellation over and over and over and over and over in these introductions, and they'll feel the same voice in A Christmas Carol. But I think that, recently I read one of Mathew's works, one of his star-signed works from the Tribune, a 4th of July essay, and I got like 5 hits. And then when I get into in-your-face proof about Mathew's plagiarist, I get 19 hits. So it's pretty clear to me what the bulk of the people are interested in, and that is they want this in-your-face stuff. They don't want anything where, you have to use your intuition and, it's not like absolute knock you on the head proof. So I'm going to stick with that for a little while, and maybe I'll read those introductions another day.